Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 5th June 2018. Now let us begin. Now we have taken this article from page 1. Now the reason this article is in the news is because the central government is going to start measuring green GDP of various states in India. Now in terms of your UPSC syllabus, in your prelims examination, it would be placed in economic and social development, more specifically sustainable development. And in similar terms, it would also be placed in general issues on environmental ecology. While in your mains examination, it would be placed in GS paper 3 within the subsection Indian economy and issues relating to sustainable development. And in similar term, it would also be placed in environmental impact assessment. Now the reason the Indian government is taking such a step is that India's environmental diversity has not yet been quantified. So India's environmental diversity has not yet been measured in terms of total number or size or any other form of quantitative analysis. The second reason as to why we need to measure the green GDP is that it would help the central government or the state government in making policy decisions. Another aspect as to why it would be helpful is that it would help in knowing what would be the financial requirement for climate mitigation. And in similar terms, the measurement of green GDP would help in the quantification in knowing what is required for sustainable development. Now hopefully up to here you have understood as to why it is required to measure green GDP. Now according to the central government, India's environmental diversity has not yet been quantified, and by measuring green GDP of states, it would help the central and the state government in making policy decisions. It would also help in knowing what would be the financial requirement for climate mitigation, and in similar term, it would also help in quantifying as to what would be the sustainable development requirement. Now the second aspect is how the green GDP would be measured. Now the calculation of green GDP would be a 5-year exercise and would be computed on a district level. Now the second aspect of measurement would be to have metrics on geography, farmlands, wildlife, and emission patterns of each district level, and it is on these metrics that data would be derived upon. Now the third and the final aspect on how green GDP would be measured is that the database would be formed from data that is available with the center and the state government. And apart from this, surveys would also be used to form data for the green GDP database. Now hopefully up till here you also understood on how the green GDP would be measured, wherein it would be a 5-year exercise and would be computed on a district level, wherein each district would be divided on a grid system. Apart from this, metrics on geography, farmlands, wildlife, and emission patterns would be formed. And moreover, this green GDP database would be formed from data that is available from center and state government. And in addition, surveys would also be carried out to collect data for the green GDP database. Now hopefully you have understood why the central government is going to measure green GDP. And in similar terms, you have also understood on how this green GDP would be measured. And so now with this, we move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 9. Now what this article talks about is that India should prepare for a third generation of right to food legislation so as we can address the failings or the drawbacks with regards to current legislation and policies on food security. Now with regards to UPSC syllabus, wherein this article would be placed in GS paper 2 within the section governance and social justice, and more specifically issues relating to hunger and welfare schemes such as the National Food Security Act for the vulnerable sections. And in similar terms, it would also be placed in GS paper 3 within the section economic development and more specifically food security. Now previously questions have been asked, wherein the first question was asked in the GS paper 2 of 2017, while the second question was asked in GS paper 3 also in 2017. When the first question had asked for suggesting measures for improvement in combating hunger, which this article tries to answer with the preparation of the third generation of right to food, while the second question has asked for the types of revolution that had taken place in agriculture and how these revolutions have helped in food security in India, wherein this article talks about the evolution of 3 different generations in food security in India. Now the article has highlighted 4 dimensions of food security, wherein the first dimension is availability, the second dimension is access, the third dimension is utilization, and the fourth dimension is stability of food security, wherein according to the author, the availability and the accessibility of food security has to an extent been taken care of in India, but the stability of food security has not been taken care of. And for this, the author highlights the 3 generations of food security in India, wherein the first generation is the generation that occurred after India's independence, wherein this generation the occurrence of famines and food shortage was very common. And because of this, food security in the first generation was defined in terms of production. And since food security was defined in terms of production, therefore the Green Revolution that occurred in the 1970s was primarily focused on increasing the quantity of food produced. And so therefore it was in the first generation that occurred after post-independence and up to the point where the Green Revolution had occurred, wherein food security in India was primarily concerned in the availability of food. And therefore the second generation occurred after the Green Revolution, which was within the time period of 1980s to 1990s, wherein the Green Revolution had allowed India to shift from a food deficit country within the first generation to a food surplus country during the second generation. But even though India became a food surplus country, hunger continued as people could not access food due to their physical or financial constraints. And therefore, in the second generation, food security in India shifted from being availability of food to ensuring access to food. But however, food security based on the access of food took a very long time in its culmination, and it was the Supreme Court verdict in the People's Union for Civil Liberties case of 2001, in which the right to food was evolved into the right to life, and it subsequently led to the National Food Security Act of 2013. Now, hopefully, up till here, you have understood the four dimensions of food security that have been highlighted by the author, wherein the first dimension was availability, then access, utilization, and the fourth dimension being stability, wherein, according to the authors, the availability and the accessibility has to an extent been implemented in India, but the stability of food security has not been. And with regards to this, the author highlights the three generations of food security in India. When the first generation occurred after independence, wherein there were large occurrences of famines and food shortages in India, and so food security was defined in terms of production, and therefore the Green Revolution that occurred in the 1970s was primarily focused on increasing the quantity of food production. And it was after this that the second generation of food security occurred in India, wherein the Green Revolution had allowed India to shift from a food deficit country to a food surplus country. But nevertheless, hunger continued as people could not access food due to their physical or financial constraints. And therefore, in the second generation, food security shifted from being defined as availability of food to also include access to food. However, access to food as part of food security took a very long time in its implementation in India, wherein the Supreme Court verdict in the People's Union for Civil Liberties case of 2001 evolved the right to food into the right to life in India, and which finally culminated in the National Food Security Act of 2013. Now, moving forward, the author highlights the various issues that are there with the National Food Security Act of 2013. Now, the first issue highlighted by the author is that the National Food Security Act does not guarantee universal right to food, wherein there are several criteria based on income and other factors upon which an individual can claim right to food under the National Food Security Act. The second aspect highlighted by the author is that the claims under the National Food Security Act is not available during periods of disaster. So in times of flood, drought, war, cyclone, earthquakes or other forms of natural disaster, an individual cannot claim right to food under the Food Security Act. And according to the author, it is during this period that a person urgently requires a right to food under the National Food Security Act. Now the third aspect highlighted by the author is that there is an absence in progressive realization in terms of providing food security under the National Food Security Act, wherein several progressive aspects such as health, environment, agriculture, sanitation are missing as parameters of the National Food Security Act. Now, hopefully, up till here, you've understood the issues that have been raised by the author with regards to the National Food Security Act of 2013, wherein the first issue highlighted by the author is that it does not guarantee universal right to food, wherein there are several criteria such as income, among other factors, which restricts the right to food under the National Food Security Act. The second aspect highlighted by the author is that claims under the National Food Security Act are not available during periods of disaster, such as earthquakes, cyclone, among other natural disasters. And according to the author, it is during these periods of emergency that an individual urgently requires both right to food and the security of food. And the final aspect highlighted by the author is that there is an absence of progressive realization in defining food security under the National Food Security Act, wherein progressive aspects such as health, sanitation, environment, agriculture, among other aspects, do not form parameters under the National Food Security Act. And it is because of these reasons that the authors are recommending a third generation to the right to food legislation. Wherein the first aspect highlighted by the author, that is requiring the third generation of food security, is that stability in terms of pricing, access, emergency time periods, among other factors, need to be addressed in India. The second aspect highlighted by the authors is that food legislation in India needs to recognize the effects of climate change and natural disasters on food security, especially of food security at the individual level. The third aspect highlighted by the author is that food legislation in India needs to incorporate progressive realization such as food diversity, environmental justice, income distribution, among other factors, to comprehensively implement food security. Now, hopefully, up till here, you've also understood the points that have been highlighted by the author, which are required for the third generation of food security, wherein it is required that stability as a principle should be incorporated in food security in terms of prices, access, among other factors, and therefore stability in food security needs to be addressed in right to food legislation in India. The second aspect highlighted by the author is that food legislation in India needs to recognize the effects of climate change and natural disasters on food security, especially at the individual level. And the final aspect that is required for the third generation of food legislation in India is to incorporate progressive realization such as food diversity, environmental justice, income distribution, among other aspects, to have a comprehensive implementation of food security in India. So, now hopefully, with this, you understand the focus of this article that food security requires the realization of availability, access, utilization, and stability of food in India, and it is after this that India can successfully implement the idea of right to food. Now, hopefully, up till here, you've understood the four dimensions of food security that has been highlighted by the author. And moreover, you also understand the three generations of food security that have been explained by the author. And so, now with this, we move on to the next article. Now, we've taken this article from page 12. Now, the reason this article is in the news is because the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which had recently won the Nobel Prize for its implementation of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, has offered to pay for the next summit between the United States and North Korea over the North Korean nuclear issue. Now, what you should know from this article is about ICAN and about the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, which have been covered in an earlier edition of the Focus magazine. So let us understand both about ICAN and the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty with the help of the Focus article itself. Now, before understanding about ICAN and the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, let us first understand as to where it would be placed in your UPSC syllabus. Now, in terms of your prelims examination, it would be placed in current events of international importance. And with regards to your mains paper, it would be placed in GS paper 2 under the international relations section, wherein the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty would be placed in global agreements affecting India's interest, and ICAN would be placed in important international agencies. Now, I had made this article for the November edition of the Focus magazine. Now, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is a coalition of non-governmental organizations promoting adherence and implementation of the United Nations Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. Now, ICAN was founded in 2007 and it was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work in drawing attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons and for its efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such nuclear weapons. Now, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is based on a similar format as the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which led to the Ottawa Treaty, and is also similar to the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in terms of its format. Now, hopefully, up till here, you have understood the basic features of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, that in terms of its types, that it is a non-governmental organization, its purpose, that it intends to promote adherence to the implementation of the United Nations Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, and one of its major features that was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work with regards to drawing attention to the use of nuclear weapons and to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now let us understand about the United Nations Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. Now this treaty was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2017 as a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. But the countries have to sign and ratify it, and it is only after that the agreement has been ratified that it could enter into legal force. Now, as to the question as to why is the treaty required? Because nuclear weapons are the only weapons of mass destruction not yet prohibited in a comprehensive and universal manner, and this agreement of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty fills a significant gap in international law wherein it is specific to the abolition of nuclear weapons. Now, in terms of features of the treaty, the agreement prohibits nations from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, possessing, stockpiling, and threatening to use nuclear weapons. It also prohibits its signatories from assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in any of these activities. Moreover, nations are obliged to provide assistance to all victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons. And this agreement would coexist and be mutually beneficial to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Regional Nuclear Weapons Free Zones, and the Treaty Banning Nuclear Test Explosions, or the NTBT. Now, this treaty is being opposed or being indifferent by the nuclear powers, wherein the nuclear powers have either refused or shown no inclination to sign the treaty. And this opposition to the treaty stems from trust deficit, wherein each nuclear power assumes that the treaty would result in abolishing their own nuclear weapons, while their rival may not choose to do so. So the trust deficit is seen in the form that maybe if India signs this agreement and abolishes its nuclear weapons, then Pakistan or China may not abolish their own nuclear weapons. And thereby, by signing this treaty, India would be at a lost position. Apart from this, the Western nuclear powers of USA, France, UK have suggested for strengthening the Non-Proliferation Treaty or the NPT. Now, hopefully, up till here, you have understood that the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2017 and that it is a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. But it can only enter into legal force after it has been ratified by a specific number of countries. Now, the reason this treaty is required because nuclear weapons are the only weapons of mass destruction which are not yet prohibited in a comprehensive and universal manner. Now, apart from this, with regards to your upcoming UPSC prelims examination, you should also know that the nuclear powers USA, France, UK, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, or suspected nuclear powers such as Israel have either refused or shown no inclination to sign the treaty. Now, hopefully, up till here, you've understood about ICAN and the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. And so, with this, we move on to the next article. Now, we have taken this article from the editorial page on page 8. Now, this article talks about the discretionary powers of the governor. And apart from this, it talks about the views of the Supreme Court in the SR Bombay case and the recommendations of the Sarkaria Commission on the discretionary powers of the governor. So, what we'll do with regards to this article is understand what are the discretionary powers of the governor and what has been the view of the Supreme Court in the SR Bombay case and the recommendations of the Sarkaria Commission with regards to the discretionary powers of the governor. Now, the article mainly highlights the discretionary power of the governor with regards to the appointment of the chief minister. Now, you have to understand that the state executive consists of the governor, who is the head of the state. And moreover, the state executive also consists of the council of ministers, with the chief minister as its head. Now, the governor acts as the constitutional head of a state under Article 153 and Article 154. But apart from this, the governor also acts as an agent of the center, because the governor holds office based on the pleasure of the president under Article 156. Now, wherein one of the discretionary power of the governor is that the governor appoints the chief minister of a state under Article 164 Clause 1, which includes inviting the leader of the single largest party in case of a hung verdict to prove majority on the floor of the house. But it is this discretionary power of the governor which the article talks about that has opened space for its misutilization. And this discretionary power of the governor to appoint the chief minister of a state led to various controversies as to whether the governor was using his discretionary power to appoint a chief minister as the constitutional head of the state or as the agent of the center. And so as to prevent this misutilization, the Supreme Court in the SR Bombay case versus Union of India case of 1994 has stated that in situations where there is a hung assembly, meaning that no political party has obtained a clear majority of seats, the final decision rests not with the various feuding parties but with the concerned legislature through a floor test. And moreover, the Sarkaria Commission specified various rules which suggested that in choosing a chief minister, the governor should be guided by the following principles. When the first principle is that the party or the combination of parties that command the widest support in the legislative assembly should be called to form the government. The second principle is that the governor starts to see that a government is formed and not try to form a government that will pursue policies that he approves of. The third principle that the governor has to follow is that if no party has a majority, then the governor has to invite firstly the pre-poll alliance, secondly the second largest party that is able to gain majority support, thirdly a post-election coalition that has the required members, and finally a post-election coalition in which the partners are willing to extend outside support. The next principle given by the Sarkaria Commission is that it has recommended that whoever is appointed as the chief minister must seek a vote of confidence in the Assembly on the floor of the House, meaning a floor test within 30 days of taking over. And lastly, according to the Sarkaria Commission, the governor should not resort to mechanisms where determining of majority of the government is done outside the Assembly. So now hopefully up till here you have understood the points raised by the article with regards to the discretionary powers of the governor in appointing the chief minister and how the SR Bombay case and the Sarkaria Commission that have limited the discretionary power of the governor in appointing the chief minister of a state so as to minimize the controversies that have arose that when the governor appoints the chief minister of a state, especially if it is a hung assembly, is he acting as the constitutional head of the state or as an agent of the center? And so now with this, we move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 9. Now the reason this article is in the news is that the central government has asked the state governments for various inputs on the proposed amendments to the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Wherein, according to this article, the scheduled list of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 does not seem to reflect the immense biodiversity of the country. Wherein, according to the author, there are a lot of inconsistencies in the list of the Wildlife Protection Act, wherein which species forms which part of the scheduled list does not take into account the scientific research that can match species to the appropriate protection. Wherein the article has given the example that a majority of the 659 species of India's endangered fish do not find mention in the list, and in similar term, 128 species of bats, which includes fruit bats, are considered vermin despite their significant role as pollinators. Now, vermin are those wild animals that are considered harmful to crops and farm animals, and bats are considered as vermin even though they have a huge impact on biodiversity because of their role as pollinators or animals that help in the pollination process. And therefore, according to the author, states should actually have the final say in what is important for protection within their territory because a species that may be widespread elsewhere may be locally endangered. But however, presently the power to amend the list of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 remains with the centre government. And with regards to this, the author has given the example of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, wherein the British introduced the deer and the elephants over a century ago, wherein the deer is now protected under Schedule 3, while the elephant is protected under Schedule 1. But these two animals have caused large scale degradation to native vegetation and threaten other forms of native animals and plants. So, according to the author, the protection that has been given to the deer or the elephant under the Wildlife Protection Act has restricted the government of Andaman and Nicobar in the protection of their own native vegetation and native animals. And this is why the author is recommending that the state should have the final say in what animal is locally endangered and therefore is required to be protected under the Wildlife Protection Act. And therefore, the final recommendation of the author is that a multi parameter list, which would be based upon local inputs of cultural significance, conservation value, among other factors, would be far greater in aiding India's biodiversity than a single central legislation. And these local inputs, according to the author, should be provided by the states. So now hopefully you have understood the argument of the author that there is a requirement for the central government to have inputs from state governments so that the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 has a comprehensive coverage in the protection of India's biodiversity. And now with this we come to an end in the analysis of today's paper. Now we move on to the question for today.